Light and architecture are inextricably intertwined, and going forward, smart lighting and smart buildings will be inextricably intertwined.
You're listening to Smart Thinking, a podcast from WSP. I'm Matthew Marson, taking you on a journey into smart buildings.
In this episode, we're talking about an illuminating topic, smart lighting. Joining me this time is Jay Wratten, who's Vice President of Sports at WSP USA, an award-winning lighting designer and smart building strategist. Welcome, Jay. First question for you is, what is a smart building and why should we care?
What I think a smart building is a building that is agile, a building that learns and adapts. Simply connecting a bunch of devices together and having a dashboard that says what's happening today is great, and we can learn a lot about it. But what we're aspiring to do here is create buildings that conform to what the users want from them today and in the future, and that might be totally different than the expectation we had when we opened them. And so really, I think we're on a journey to get there. There are some aspects where we have smart buildings that really do respond, but it takes the right amount of planning and coordination and solutions, right? So.
Lots of people in our industry seem to think that the key to producing a really good smart building is to use a smart lighting solution. So could you tell us about what a smart lighting solution is?
I think that lighting is becoming a really important component of smart buildings for a couple of reasons. Light is everywhere. So anywhere we have a space that people are in, we typically have lights. Those lights are in the ceiling, so they go in as part of the building's infrastructure. And they have consistent power. So it places lights and lighting controls in a prime position to be the sensory network or enabling network for a number of smart building devices that we might want to create data sets from in order to allow that larger goal of a responsive building. So I think when we think about lighting, there's two components. There's a smart lighting control system ability to respond and adapt to their users. So that could be something like learning when people typically come into the office, anticipating those times and turning on ahead of them. It could be changing the spectrum of lights quality in order to reinforce the circadian rhythm of the folks that are in the space.
And what is a circadian rhythm for those that might not know?
Sure. Circadian rhythm. So our bodies have a clock. And that clock is reinforced every day by the rising and falling of the sun and the change in spectrum of light that creates. There are receptors in our eyes that detect, they're called IPRGCs, that detect a certain wavelength of light, and that helps set our body's clock that keeps us awake at certain times of the day and asleep at other times of the day. Now, the fact that we are inside 90% of the time means that we aren't necessarily getting enough natural light stimulation to reset that clock. And it can result in short and long-term health issues for people that live in buildings for the most of the time. And so there's a number of researchers and interesting data coming out around the role that electric lighting plays in reinforcing or unintentionally screwing up that circadian rhythm. So it's part of a smart lighting solution, not the only part, but certainly on the forefront.
So are you saying that smart lighting could actually help with health and well-being?
Absolutely. It's early days, and when we start to get into health and well-being, I think we need to be careful about talking about lighting as medicine, right? This isn't a dose or a prescription. But at the same time, there is growing evidence that we can do harm, and so therefore we should be doing good. And lighting plays a great part in that.
So far we've spoken about smart lighting being able to adjust to schedules and the things that people are doing on the inside, to health and well-being in terms of circadian rhythm. And what other features of the solution have you seen?
A couple of things. So one of the big transitions that lighting has made in the past, let's call it decade, has been the transition from our traditional lighting sources, incandescent, fluorescent, metal halide, to a solid state or digital source, which is LED. That transition brought lighting into the digital, let's call it that, and enables us to more easily have bidirectional communication with the light fixtures, meaning that we can tell them what to do, turn on, turn off, dim, etc. But they can tell us things like, I've been running for this much time, I'm consuming this much energy, I'm malfunctioning. So one of the components of smart lighting then becomes a way to better service the building. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, now that we're into digital, is that it's very easy to put additional data gathering sensors onto fixtures because they are sort of already that network. And so that smart lighting system now becomes a network to report that data back to this larger smart building.
Wow, so you're saying that because the sensors are in the ceiling, you've essentially got full view using sensors of things that are happening on the floor?
Yes, so occupancy is a great example. Lighting code in most of the world is now requiring us to have something called an occupancy sensor in most spaces. It's an energy saving device, it's a maintenance device, so that if I'm in my private office and I leave, the occupancy sensor shuts off the space. What we have seen as a result of that is occupancy sensors starting to show up all over buildings. What a connected or smart lighting control system allows is not only does that sensor, which is in the building, now telling the lights to turn on and off, it gives us a lot more valuable information about how people use the space and allows our building to better respond to that use.
I remember working with a high-growth tech company once who wanted to use the occupancy sensors for just that sort of thing. They were struggling to keep up with the demands from different teams as the business was growing so quickly. So they were able to use the data from the occupancy sensors to keep a track of exactly what the usage was so that they didn't have to go and take extra rentable space and they could really kind of flex the space to the best way it was working, and also to help justify some investment decisions for different types of work setting given the neighborhood scheme that they were using. So it's really interesting to see how in some cases lighting systems that already have this capability are unlocking entire new use cases. So with that in mind, what are the sorts of challenges that you're typically seeing from clients now, and how are you responding to them?
I think simply getting all of the connected lighting and other smart systems to aggregate data into one place is a challenge. So we've traditionally designed and built, I should say, buildings in silos. Our HVAC engineer, our lighting engineer, our security engineer, right, are all building systems as get built in silos by contractors or subcontractors whose sole responsibility is that system. When we start to look at a smart building where the occupancy data from the lighting control system contributes to these other outcomes, it becomes critical that that data has a way to get to that larger platform. So one of the challenges is making sure that the building is designed and constructed in order to enable that outcome. A second challenge that we're seeing is a skills gap. So our traditional developer or facility manager hasn't been tasked with using the kind of real-time and historical data that we have. They may not even have someone whose responsibility that is to do those sorts of things. And the client that you mentioned before is a good example where we're starting to see new job titles emerge out of smart buildings. So we're starting to see clients that have chief workplace digital officers, right, whose job it is to look at the data that these buildings are generating and then drive that into decisions and outcomes. And so the skills gap is something we definitely need to address. And then thirdly, I think I talked a little bit about connecting things together, but trying to enable that sort of open sharing of data, a standard format, a standard protocol for how data is exchanged, is another challenge that we're seeing. And we're coming out of a space where most of the solutions are proprietary or were proprietary historically, and it is a paradigm shift to start to think about your individual solution. If I'm a vendor sitting in this larger ecosystem of data, right? And so we're trying to break down those historically proprietary walls and show vendors that there is business value for them in sharing the data and being part of a larger solution, even if they don't own all of it.
If I were a client and I was interested in pursuing a smart lighting solution, what would be your top tips?
Well, I think it starts with why. Define what you mean by smart building and why it brings value to you or your business. We've talked a lot here this morning about technical solutions, what we're doing to enable a responsive and agile building. But if it doesn't make business sense and you don't have a strong driver for doing it, the top tip would be you're probably going to fail. You'll either fail in execution, or you'll fail in planning, or you'll fail downstream because you're simply not using the data and the opportunity that you created. And you won't be able to assign a revenue stream or a business value to the cost, which, we should be honest, is not nothing in the context of a smart building. So I think the top tip is to really go through that strategy, the roadmap, understand why you're doing it, and make sure that you are engineering solutions and outcomes that support that reasoning.
A big thank you to Jay Wratten, who's joined us on live link from Colorado. In the next episode, I'm joined by the Director of Connected Workspace at Facility Manager Mighty, where we'll be discussing how actionable IoT data is used in the real world.
If something in this episode has piqued your interest, then have a chat with us. Email smart@wsp.com.
You've been listening to Smart Thinking, a podcast from WSP. I'm Matthew Marson, and thanks for listening.